Ask your retro gaming YouTuber if the Evercade EXP is right for you.
It's yours?
No,
My mother said she found it in your closet.
I don't know. One of the guys was
Close to what?
Look, Dad, it's
Where
not.
did you get it?
Dad,
Answer me. Who taught you how to do this stuff?
You, all right? I learned it by watching you.
Parents who use Evercade have children who use Evercade. Eight-bit joystick. What is the Evercade EXP? The Evercade EXP is a relatively new, released in December 2022, retro video game emulation handheld platform that plays collections of retro games on small, affordable cartridges. It is a revised follow-up to the previous Evercade Handheld and the Evercade VS TV console. It is designed and sold by the UK company Blaze Entertainment. That's the big difference between the Evercade EXP and all the cheap, unofficial, unlicensed emulator consoles is that the Evercade is doing everything legit, legal, and high quality with a focus towards the video game collector. Their games are officially licensed game releases and are curated into theme collection cartridges that tend to sell between $20 and $30. They are trying to be different from the bootleg systems by being better. And I tell you, popping in a cartridge into a console is a deliciously retro way to play official releases of retro games. Now, I don't have a shortage of ways to play retro video games, but I found myself asking if I really needed yet another way to play them. And the more I looked at the Evercade EXP, the more I'm going to resoundingly say, yes, I do. Why I got one. Peer pressure. At Portland Retro Gaming Expo 2023, I went to the Evercade discussion panel that starred many of my favorite senpai retro gaming YouTubers, Metal Jesus Rocks, John Hancock, and John Riggs. They were talking about what they liked about the Evercade line of games and consoles. Now, I knew a little bit about Evercade at that point, but that panel really piled on the peer pressure at a pretty darn strong rate, and after the expo, I found myself ordering an Evercade EXP on Amazon. Who taught you to use the Evercade EXP? I learned it from watching you, alright? I learned it from watching you! What I like about the Evercade EXP, the concept. The Evercade EXP is an attempt to do something that feels old using newer modern technology. It is deliberately cozy, easy to use, and nostalgic. It is the Hyuga handheld. It is a proprietary Linux handheld that runs games off cartridges, and the system retails between $130 and $150. It has Wi-Fi, but it only uses it for system updates and a game of the month. But the real action is on cartridges. The EXP is backwards compatible with the entire library of games for the original system. It is a designer experience for those of us that grew up with cartridges. This is for the Game Boy generation, not the smartphone generation. The design. As a horizontally oriented retro handheld, it has an ergonomic premium white design that looks like something if it was made by Apple and Sid Mead. I don't know why, but I particularly like all the grills on the back. It is super comfortable in your hand with a rounded design, and it feels sturdy, powerful, and premium. It has a gorgeous 800 by 480 pixels bright LCD screen that can run classic games with scan lines. It has a larger battery, a more powerful processor, and 16 times the RAM than the original Evercade. Apparently, the processor can handle emulation of everything up to from around PlayStation 1 and Dreamcast. It has a headphone jack and charges via USB-C. By the way, emulation is not a dirty word. The system is powerful enough to run every single game at full frame rate with no noticeable lag. There are 4 buttons on the front, and 2 by the D-pad, and 4 on the top. It's actually pretty decent for playing Street Fighter as long as you're used to playing Super Nintendo style button layouts, but more on button layouts later on. It has a Tate mode button and A and B buttons near the D-pad that are designed to be used when the system is being held vertically to play Tate mode retro games in the correct aspect ratio and vertical format. This sucker is designed to play arcade games, and that includes Tate mode games. It's particularly cool that it supports Tate mode with cartridges that were published when only the original system was on the market. Cartridges are cool. Cartridges are a big selling point. You can easily get them in and out of the system, and there's a simple label on the front and simple branding on the back. They are fun to use and very aesthetically pleasing. They come with a clamshell plastic box with a color manual, and they also have pretty quick loading. By the way, they are hot swappable, meaning you can pull them in and out without having to shut the system off. That's nice. Now, there are advantages to having cartridges. They are real, physical, tangible things that you can have on your shelves, and they can sell them to you. There's no piracy, and the loading times are ridiculously fast. But there's the problem of having to actually physically have a copy of it. Modern game systems like the Switch and the PlayStation 4 have digital releases of every single physical game, so if you can't get a physical copy of it, you can at least buy a digital version, at least for as long as the game is in the game store. But that's the rub. Sometimes digital games get delisted and aren't available in every region, and sometimes digital game stores straight up close, like the case of the 3DS and the Wii U store and the Wii Shop. Curation of real licensed games. The big takeaway at the panel at PGRE is that the releases were curated. It wasn't just hundreds of random games, but it was a handful of games that were selected to represent a particular publisher or genre. And there are indie retro game releases, as well as classic retro. The price point of the games are between $20 and $30. That's the perfect hit of video game consumption dopamine without having to break the bank or to justify a $70 modern game purchase. It's also completely possible to collect the entire library. Like, that's a realistic collector goal, at least compared to other game systems. Western designed. It is a new Western video game platform, and we haven't seen one in a long time, not since the Xbox. It is designed in the UK, and that's where the company is set. They have various distribution deals with various Japanese and Western retro video game companies, and they license games from them. There's also a wide selection of microcomputers, Atari Lynx, and television and Commodore 64 games. I know shockingly little about the British retro computer microcomputer scene. These are platforms that I'm curious about, and I'm unlikely to actually buy the actual hardware to play them. It seems like it's safer for me to pick up cartridges for systems such as the Intellivision and the Atari Lynx collections than it would be for me to track down original hardware for those systems. Included games library. The system includes a built-in collection of 18 Capcom games and includes the Arim Arcade 1 collection. By the way, these look great. I showed Final Fight to Marcy, and she exclaimed that it looked good and inquired if it was the Super Nintendo edition of the game. And I explained no, it is the full-fat arcade edition of Final Fight. The cases are pretty sweet. By the way, the cases have a consistent graphic design to them. They have the names on the spines, and there's a numerical release, and the arcade collections are purple, and the console collections are maroon. What I don't like about the Evercade XP: button layout. For some reason, they thought it would be a good idea to have a 4-button style Super Nintendo button layout, but switch the location of the A and B buttons and the X and Y buttons. The A button is on the bottom, the B button is on the right, and the X is on the left, and the Y is on the top. Now, to go in and out of the menus, you have to consciously remember that you're using an Evercade and the A button is in a different place. It is hard to try to unlearn 3 decades of user interface design. Now, they support button remapping, but I haven't gone down that road yet. Slight light leak in the dark. I noticed this last night while playing a game before bed that there is some very minor light leak through the face of the console towards the bottom. It's not a deal breaker, but you're not going to notice it unless you're in complete darkness or near darkness. Mini HDMI output. It's mini HDMI, not full-size HDMI, and not the micro HDMI that you're going to see on a Raspberry Pi 4. Luckily, I had a Neo Geo Mini, and I had a mini HDMI cable, and that's what I'm using. I think they definitely could have fit a full-size HDMI cable on here, and they have these rubber plugs covering up the screw holes, and they totally could have put a full-size HDMI port with a rubber cap. Now, they do have the Evercade VS console system, which is not portable, but you don't really need one if you have one of these because you can just plug it into your TV. And it's pretty darn good for HDMI capture as well, which is what I primarily use for this YouTube channel. No standby mode. Now, with the latest firmware, the screen will go dim after a while if you don't press a button for a certain period of time, such as 30 seconds or a minute. And there's this LED indicator that will flash purple, and you wake it up again by pressing a button, and it takes a couple moments. Now, you have to hold down the power button to turn the system on, and it takes a couple seconds to boot up. What some people wish for is that if you click the power button, it would go into a sleep mode quickly and put it to sleep, and then clicking again to instantly wake it up. It's close, but it's not quite there yet. Some collections not on cartridge. There are console exclusive collections that are not on cartridge, such as collections from Taito and Capcom. Evercade is coming out with a $60 budget line called the Hyper Megatech Super Pocket, which, by the way, is a great name, and it is a smaller Game Boy Pocket sized device that plays Evercade cartridges. There's a Capcom edition and a Taito edition. It's an affordable $60 purchase, but I would rather buy a cartridge that has the Taito games on them, and I hope that they do that in the future. Some collectors were a little offended that the Capcom collection was built into the system and not available as a separate cartridge. A relatively small library. I wish that there was a larger library, but they're working on it. I really hope that they sell a lot of the Hyper Megatech Super Pockets, and that more video game publishers sign onto them and let them put their libraries of games on the little cartridges. Sadly, some of the cartridges are starting to go out of print and now being listed on their websites as legacy releases, and that's a little troubling. I wouldn't mind getting the Technos NES collection, but it's out of print and out of stock. Of course, I have all these games on Famicom, but that's just me. The user interface for the EXP, there's the cartridge, the games that are on the cartridge, and then the games that are on the system, such as the Capcom collection, the Game of the Month, and the hidden games. And then there is the settings. On the display option, there's original ratio, which fills the screen, Pixel Perfect, which has everything scaled to an optimum place, full screen if you hate yourself. So there's no shaders, subtle scan lines, and strong scan lines. Both are actually pretty subtle. I usually pick one. Bezels, I always prefer off. I want a nice black screen. And Tate mode bezels. Again, I prefer it off. Dynamic rate control, force HDMI PAL mode. Actually, I'm going to disable that. And scan lines. There is Binder's Tale, the hidden games. I believe this is like an NES style game. Don't know much about it, but it's the Game of the Month for October. Hidden games, there's Gotris, Gribley's Day Out, Kubo 1 and 2. I'm gonna assume that's pronounced N. Rogue 64, Spacey McRacy. But Start with the Irene collection. Originally an arcade game based on American football, and a early Famicom conversion was published by Nintendo on the NES. Nice. Well, one of the better 8-bit football games, which is fine, but... And when you're in a game, there's an instant load last save, and read more. There's a little bit of text about it, a little bit of history, and a little bit of commentary. There's coin-op limits, play in competition mode, and you can edit the controls. Battle Chopper, an arcade game from 1987. This is pretty cool because I don't think I've ever played this before. Not the most realistic game. It's nice that it's a shooter but not auto-scrolling. In the Hunt, 1993. I think I remember reading something about this game being an inspiration for Metal Slug, and I can definitely see that given the explosions and break-in. The game actually has a pretty big selection of games, and it's pretty cool that they have some more obscure stuff on here. Lightning Swords. I don't think this actually came out in the US. This is sort of a one-button game. Moon Patrol from 1982. I used to play this at Chuck E. Cheese. So those of you who don't know, Moon Patrol is an early game. It has some parallax scrolling there that was new at the time. Concept of a little jumping little dude is new, and that you also need to either blow up the obstacles or jump over them. And finally, the arcade version of R-Type. You can either charge your shot, get a little option pod, which you can then press and have it dock with you. I remember watching a video that said that this should have been the pack-in game for the TurboGrafx 16 in America, which is an interesting theory. It would have done better if it would have had this excellent arcade version of R-Type. And before I go through the EXP collection, I want to show you what it looks like when you swap out the carts. So I just put in the Atari Collection 1, which has some 2800 and 2600 and 7800 games. So a lot of the graphic settings carry over. Very cool. And the EXP collection, the Capcom collection, 1942, 1943, 1944, Bionic Commando, the arcade edition. By the way, arcade, 16-bit Super Nintendo, arcade, Forgotten Worlds Arcade, Ghouls and Ghosts Arcade, Legendary Wings Arcade, Mega Man home release, Mega Man's home release, Arcade, Vulgus, and Wolf of the Battlefield. So there is 1942, 1943, 1944, Bionic Commando, Breath of Fire, Captain Commando, Commando, Final Fight, Forgotten Worlds, Ghouls and Ghosts, Legendary Wings, Mega Man, Mega Man 2, Mega Man X, Street Fighter 2, Hyper Fighting, Strider, Vulgus, and Wolf of the Battlefield, Mercs. Now, if you've never played the arcade edition of 1942, if you've only played the crappy Myconics developed home port, that was not made by Capcom. It was actually made by a subcontractor, Myconics. Shooting game, but you can sort of see this is where the 1940 series came from. 1943 from 1987. Now, if you notice both of these, so B is shoot, A is loop or special attack. I would have had that the other way, but whatever. Tate mode games, I'm of course capturing via HDMI, but if I was playing this, I would of course turn the console vertical and use Tate mode. So I thought it was cool to show that they had games from the 80s, the 90s, and here's one from 2000. Bionic Commando, the arcade edition. So, despite having similar play controls, it's a very different game than Bionic Commando for NES. Bionic Commando for NES is a non-linear... I am not... Okay, I'll get serious. So, Bionic Commando is an action-adventure game, while for NES, while Bionic Commando for the arcade is pure action. Breath of Fire, a Capcom RPG, but clearly a Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest inspired classic role-playing game made by Capcom. This is one of the beginning points where it just has a ton of expository dialogue before you actually get to control the character. By the way, for the saves, you have up to 6 slots and a fast control, so that's cool. Or a fast save. Capcom Commando, the 1981 beat-em-up. Pretty cool that Capcom had them release one of their newer yet less known fighting games. Again, I'd love to see some Konami game or some Capcom and Konami games on the Evercade. I'd love to see, now that the Evercade XP is more powerful than the original hardware, I really would love to see them pursue 90s games, especially the arcade editions. Commando, the arcade game from 1985. Commando, the arcade game from 1985. Now I have vertical scan lines on here, and it's a little dark, so I'm going to adjust the display settings. None. There we go, that's looking better. So the enemy will kill you with a touch, and they don't die when you touch them. Very nice. Now, Forgotten Worlds, I'm actually glad to see that they're able to modify the controls, because when this game was released in the arcade, it had a spinner. So what they're using is the L and R buttons to spin the reticle, because the Evercade does not have an analog stick. I'm sort of surprised, not terribly surprised, but they didn't have a analog. When they made the second version, I'm sort of surprised that they didn't put an analog stick on it, or a spinner, which could be used, or an analog stick, which could be used as a spinner. But Forgotten Worlds for the arcade is one of my favorite Capcom shooters. It's right up there with Sidearms. But I actually played this in the arcade back in the day with a spinner. I liked the Sega Genesis version. But the actual arcade version just has this perfect Capcom arcade feel to it. Ghouls and Ghosts, the arcade edition. Very familiar to those who have played the Sega Genesis version, but I would also say that the Super Graphics version is pretty darn close. Legendary Wings, very 80s Capcom. A vertical shooter, which then switches to side-scrolling. Ah, shoot. This game did the Xevious thing about having both a forward attack and a bomb for ground targets. And here you can go inside for a side-scrolling stage. Mega Man. Good old classic Mega Man. I grow impatient with his shenanigans. Mega Man 2. I would absolutely buy a Mega Man collection if it was released on Evercade. As you can see, all the emulators work great. They look exactly how they should. No graphic issues, no slowdown. Music sounds great. The full arcade version so that's one of the hardest ones to pull off because I'm actually having to use the shoulder buttons. Controversial opinion, I actually prefer Champion Edition to Turbo. I sort of think I like the flow of the slower game better, but look at that detail. This is the arcade edition. The other big game for me on here is Strider. The other big game for me on here is the arcade perfect port of Strider. Well, not a port at all. The original arcade game of Strider. I love the fact that the little robots were wearing raccoon hats. Or fur hats. Shoot. No compromises from the arcade version of Strider. Love this game. Capcom's first game, Vulgus, from 1984. Pretty deep cut, if I do say so myself. You know, I just want to say shout out to Jeremy Parrish for pointing out the importance of Xevious on Japanese shooter arcade design, and here we are, Vulgus, probably deeply inspired by Xevious. And the final game in the collection, Wolf of the Battlefield, aka Mercs. I feel a little late to the Evercade party, but I'm glad that I'm finally there. I'm glad that it's on the market, and I can totally see myself putting together a pretty sweet cartridge collection and keeping the cases. It is awesome that they're using a new tech to embrace an old style of retro gaming. There is such a rich legacy of 2D games made during the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and I hope that many more gets released for the Evercade. The Evercade might not be for everybody, but for those of you who are into collecting retro games on cartridge, it's pretty awesome. It's definitely for me. This is 8-Bit Joystick. Stay awesome. Play retro.